and women and the labor movement and kind of stuff. Civil rights a little bit too. Women's suffrage. Put it kind of everything in context. Who's that?
Luther King.
Martin Luther King. Who's that? Barry
I
Goldwater.
am not going to sit here and be an idle spectator to the diminution, the subversion, the destruction of the Constitution.
The word democracy does not appear anywhere in the Constitution.
You don't need a filibuster. You need some action.
Who's that?
Yet the spirit of democracy, that every citizen shall have a
Gloria
voice,
Steinem.
has been present since the founding of the United States.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
It is that spirit which has taken root and blossomed in all corners of our society, from feminists to migrant farm workers, from anti-war protesters to anti-abortion protesters, from advocates of civil rights to advocates of gay rights, from the physically challenged to the environmentally concerned. It is the spirit of democracy which has inspired activists of all stripes to fight for their rights and their beliefs.
Women's suffrage is a long story of hard work and heartache.
One of the earliest and longest political movements in United States history was the women's suffrage movement. When it began, women had few rights of any kind.
In 1848, a group of very brave women and men who didn't seem to be bothered much by public opinion got together at the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. And out of that convention, they brought forth this 1848 Declaration of Sentiments. It was a play on words that began that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. It really did begin the demand for women's equality in a strong and concerted and movement-like way, and began right off the bat with taking on issues that others thought were foolish or too radical, issues like women's right to vote.
The suffrage movement was only the first wave of a feminist movement which revived in the 1960s in the so-called second wave.
The women's rights movement in the United States has had two great waves, and both of them grew out of the civil rights movement in one sense or another. In the early part of this country, during the abolition drive, a lot of the women's rights supporters were great abolitionists, and yet the women found themselves frustrated at that period, just as the women in the 60s found themselves frustrated in the anti-war and civil rights and other movements, that their voices were not heard or weren't taken as seriously, that the leadership roles were not as open to them. And using the techniques, the tactics, the strategies, and the principles of the civil rights and the abolition movement, a lot of these women's rights supporters, women and men, formed their own movement on behalf of women's rights.
This is the largest ever march for women's lives.
Whether it's law, medicine, religion, journalism, or the government, I think that until women have a fair share of power, until we're equally represented at the decision-making tables, in the corporate suites and in the White House, that we really have unfinished business to do.
The civil rights movement grew from a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, to a nationwide call for an end to segregation and racial discrimination. One day in December of 1955, Rosa Parks refused to sit in the back of the bus. The rest is history.
Yeah, I decided to get involved in desegregating segregated facilities because I felt that it was a must that everybody was an American, that everybody should have an equal part of the pie. I didn't really wait on an organization because I felt like a lot of times too much time is spent on organizing, that somebody got to get going and then people to follow. and this is the approach I take. I got ideas in my mind, and then I carry it to some more people on desegregating everything that I can think about in Waco.
We changed the laws in the South. Prior to the Civil Rights Movement in the early 1960s, black citizens couldn't vote in any of our southern states. Now they can, and there are many black elected officials in Congress and in state and local government as a result. That's a change that came about because of citizen activism. It didn't come about because of government policy.
No justice, no peace!
The Civil Rights Movement brought sweeping changes in United States society and government. But the work of fighting discrimination goes on.
The Southern Poverty Law Center was founded in 1971, primarily to take on litigation following up on the laws that was passed during the American Civil Rights Movement, basically representing poor people in class action lawsuits. Over the years, though, the Southern Poverty Law Center has changed. It's added new projects as new issues have developed. In the early 1980s, we started a project called Klan Watch. Later, we added the Militia Task Force to it, and we track hate groups and extremist groups in the country and bring litigation against organizations that, like the Ku Klux Klan and the White Aryan Resistance, whose members harm individuals, mainly minorities.
We're not here to tear down America.
The Million Man March in 1995 was a demonstration of the great strength and solidarity at the heart of the African American community today. It reminded blacks and whites that the legacy of the Civil Rights Movement lives on.
I would classify the Million Man March as a social movement, bringing people together, helping them learn more about themselves, helping them to realize what is going on around them in their communities, in their households, how they can do better to improve their family life, to improve their life in general, and how they can become more in touch with themselves.
We as black males have been so misrepresented in the media, in literature, on the evening news, that seeing such a gathering of beings who happen to be black and male, and gathering without violence, gathering in love, gathering in responsibility. It was probably the first time anywhere that the world, period, had seen that many men who came together, particularly black men, under such peaceful and spiritual conditions.
The American Indian Movement, to many of us, it's not an organization. It's an idea, and it's an idea about freedom.
You saw that.
Whereas the Civil Rights Movement may have been asking for a piece of the pie, so to speak, a piece of the political pie, a piece of the economic pie, a piece of the social pie. From the indigenous perspective, all of the pie was stolen.
We have bet our lives that we can make change for the American Indian, whether we live or die.
The American Indian Movement began in the late 1960s, a time when many groups were pressuring the government for change. The smallest minority group in the United States, Native Americans, are also its only indigenous peoples.
The colonization of my people was almost total. But that spark happened, because of prison services to two Ojibwe-Indians, Dennis Banks and Clyde Ballacourt. And they, with others, started the American Indian Movement in the city of Minneapolis to combat police brutality and educational racism in their curriculum. And it just spread like wildfire.
No more Columbus Day! No more Columbus Day!
Every Indian wanted to be proud, and we stood up en masse, and the white people didn't know what to do with us. Especially the authorities, the government, the police. They didn't know what to do with militant Indians.
The American Indian movement opened all those doors that were closed, slammed shut in our faces for so long. It wasn't out of social consciousness, but it was because somebody was there saying, you know, it's going to be done, and you know, we'll take whatever methods we have to make changes, but you know, we're not going to stand for this any longer. We are first-class American citizens, and we're not taking second-class status anymore.
We unambiguously describe the American Indian movement as a national liberation movement. That means that as a people, we have the right to be free. We have the right to self-determination.
Pittsburgh town.
The labor movement in the United States began to build around the turn of the century as industrialization increased jobs but lowered workers' control over their lives and working conditions.
We are important because of the work we do. We are human beings whose sweat and sacrifice brings food to the tables of millions and millions of people.
In the mid-1960s, a man named Cesar Chavez organized migrant farm workers into a union called the United Farm Workers.
This group was forming in Delano, California. And it was in December of '64. That's the first time you heard in nationwide Cesar Chavez's name, because the UAW gave him quite a few amounts of money for the organizing of the farm workers, and Cesar Chavez accepted the position, and we started working there from then on.
When California grape growers refused to negotiate, Chavez called for a boycott of table grapes.
I was working full-time for better than 2 years, full-time with the Cesar Chavez campaign with the grape workers. And I was involved all over the country, from Massachusetts, Connecticut, all the way in the northern states to California and the south.
The boycott lasted 5 years, but it ended in a victory for the union. The United Farm Workers' cause did not end with a single victory. As recently as 1996, an agreement was negotiated with Red Coach Lettuce, giving crop pickers greater benefits. La causa, as Chavez called it, continues.
We want the killing stopped. Will you stay in the fight until every last baby is protected?
Everything that we're doing, we basically learned from the labor unions and from other interest groups on the left who have exercised a great deal of influence in the Democrat Party. Bottom line is that you have to go out there and you have to organize people who share common goals and desires with you and get them politically active. And that's what we've done.
Our purpose is not to legislate family values. It is to ensure that Washington values families.
The conservative religious movement is probably the most successful political movement in the United States of the late 20th century.
We are placed here for a purpose by a higher power.
From local school boards to Capitol Hill, this movement has gained power and influence at every level of government.
The Christian Coalition at its peak, while I was there, was involved in up to 2 million get-out-the-vote phone calls per election cycle, up to 60 to 70 million pieces of voter education literature distributed either in the mail or in churches or in shopping centers or voting locations.
I don't see it as a religious issue. I see it as an American issue.
Well, I really don't think it's religion. I think it's just the morals of the country. That's how I look at it.
We really brought religious, conservative people of faith into the mainstream of our politics in a way that I think they never had been before. I think they were largely viewed as a marginal force, or they were viewed suspiciously by people, maybe as potentially dangerous and dark.
Look at this group behind me. Do you see any extremists or fanatics back there?
I think by the time we got done, I won't say it was viewed as passé, but just as there are labor unions and feminist groups and trial lawyers and veterans groups and business groups, it was pretty much viewed as pro-family, religious conservative activists are a permanent fixture in American politics. They're never going to go away.
NRA members, don't back down. We don't shrink from a fight.
Organizing for change is a time-honored tradition in United States democracy. Interest groups, minorities, people with strong goals or grievances all have found that change can come about with planning, pressure, and persistence.
In California, one of the very first campaigns that we worked on, or I worked on as a political consultant, was Proposition 13 in 1978, the property tax initiative with Howard Jarvis that completely changed the entire tax structure of the state of California, which is credited with setting off a national tax revolt, which many people believe led to the election of Ronald Reagan. Another great example, it started here in the state of California, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And here it was started by one woman whose daughter was killed by a drunk driver. It grew into a statewide movement and a national movement that has changed drunk driving laws and the public attitude about drunk driving dramatically.
It's a blatant attempt for the tobacco lobby to just rape the public health. This is the worst legislative process the American Cancer Society has ever experienced.
Another big issue right now, right in the headlines every day, that we're seeing directly coming from citizen action is smoking and the anti-smoking movement. Starting really with just a few activists growing into a national movement and now making dramatic policy changes on a national basis.
Democracy is a multitude of voices, of opinions and cultures and values competing for power in the political arena. It is therefore dependent upon information and upon communication. Do greater amounts of information and more immediate forms of communication improve the workings of democracy? CNN, the 24-hour news channel broadcast globally, has been credited with not only enhancing response time to current events, but actually contributing to political change by disseminating information more widely and more quickly than ever before.
I think at the most basic level, the more open your channels of communication, the better it is for democratic forms of government, who can only thrive with a certain amount of openness. And I think we've seen, some of the, I don't mean to say CNN has caused these things, but I think we and others have played a role in everything from the liberalization of politics inside the former Soviet Union to the signs of maybe some increased openness in Cuba to even North Korea, one of the most closed societies on earth.
Some commentators have labeled the instant information and shortened response time to breaking news the CNN effect. Even high government officials rely on CNN to bring them the news more quickly than government channels. And when Ross Perot revealed his intention to run for president, he chose to do so on CNN. Does a media provider like CNN have any accountability for the political outcome of its content?
I think our impact is generally to keep people better informed about things near and far, and to give them a full, fair breadth of viewpoints, so that they're not just getting an American viewpoint or a liberal viewpoint or a conservative viewpoint, but they're getting a Palestinian and an Israeli and an American and all the different American viewpoints. So they can hear all kinds of views on a particular set of events and intelligently make up their own minds before voting, before supporting, before opposing, before moving forward as citizens.
Democracy is not a magic formula. It requires participation and it demands responsibility from the people who must guide it.
Political participation is essential in a democracy for anyone that really wants to preserve freedom and control over their own lives.
We obviously believe that it's not only important and not only possible, but it's essential to the survival of who we are as human beings to organize.
And you can make a difference. difference. One person can make a difference.
Everybody's in politics, whether you like it or not. From the day you're born until the day you die, you're in politics.
Well, what you think of that?